They say God watches over the faithful, that those who kneel in prayer will find mercy when judgment comes. That devotion is armor against injustice. And I believed this with the fervor of someone who had nothing else to believe in. Believed it when I knelt at the altar every morning before dawn. Believed it when I scrubbed the chapel floors until my hands bled. Believed it when I took my vows and bound myself to a life of service, thinking I was choosing salvation, when what I was actually choosing was a different kind of damnation. And the day they called me to the altar, it was not for blessing, but for accusation. Not for prayer, but for judgment. And I learned that God does not watch the convent as closely as the abbess does. That mercy is a concept that dissolves under scrutiny. That being forgotten by God is less painful than being remembered by those who claim to speak for him. My name is Thomason, and I was 16 when I entered the convent of St. Catherine. Entered not from calling, but from necessity, because my father had died leaving debts, and my mother had 3 younger daughters to feed. And a convent would take me without dowry, if I agreed to a life of labor instead of contemplation, if I became a lay sister rather than a true nun. And I agreed because what choice did a girl have when the alternative was selling herself in ways that would destroy her soul more certainly than any vow of chastity? And I thought myself lucky. Thought that hard work and prayer were small prices to pay for safety, for a roof and food and the protection of holy walls. And for 2 years I was content, was even happy in the simple routines. The prayers at set hours, the work in the garden, the silence that felt like peace rather than oppression. Sister Magdalene arrived in the spring of my 3rd year. Arrived from a larger convent in the north with a reputation for exceptional piety, for visions and prophetic dreams, for a devotion so pure it bordered on the transcendent, and the abbess welcomed her with a ceremony that made clear this was someone important, someone whose presence elevated our small establishment, and we were all instructed to learn from her example, to observe her practices and aspire to her level of faith. And I truly tried, because I wanted to be good, wanted to be worthy of the life I had been given, wanted to believe that devotion could transform me into something more than a girl no one wanted. Magdalene was beautiful in the way saints are beautiful in paintings, pale and ethereal with enormous dark eyes that seemed to look through the material world into something beyond. And she moved through the convent like she was floating, spoke in whispers that made you lean close to hear, spent hours in the chapel in postures of such extreme devotion that her body would be rigid when she finally rose. And the other sisters watched her with awe, with envy, with the desperate hope that proximity to such holiness might somehow transfer to them. And I watched too, but what I saw was different. Saw the way she arranged her suffering for maximum visibility. Saw the calculation in choosing which penances to perform where others could witness. Saw that her devotion was a performance refined through years of practice. But I said nothing, because who was I to question someone the abbess herself venerated? Who was I to trust my own observation over the consensus of women wiser and more experienced? She took interest in me after I had been watching her for perhaps 2 months. Took interest that felt flattering at first. Asked me to walk with her in the garden, to pray beside her in the chapel, to share the small cell she had been given rather than sleeping in the dormitory with the other lay sisters. And I was honored, was grateful, thought I had been chosen for some quality she saw in me, some potential for holiness I had not recognized in myself. And I moved my few possessions into her cell, and I tried to match her devotions, tried to pray as long and as fervently, tried to achieve whatever state of grace she seemed to inhabit. And she encouraged me, said I had a gift, said she could see the divine light in me, said that together we could achieve a communion with God that few ever experienced. And I believed her because I desperately wanted to be special, wanted to matter, wanted my life to have meaning beyond scrubbing floors and pulling weeds. The visions started 3 weeks after I moved into her cell. Started as dreams so vivid, they felt more real than waking. Dreams where I saw things that had not happened yet, where I heard voices speaking truths I could not possibly know. And I told Magdalene about them, and she said this was God speaking through me, said I was blessed, said these visions were proof that my devotion had been recognized, and she made me describe every detail, wrote everything down in a journal she kept hidden, and she said we must keep this private, must not tell the abbess yet, because such gifts needed to be carefully nurtured before they could be revealed. And I trusted her completely, thought she was protecting me, when what she was actually doing was something else entirely. Something I would not understand until much later. The visions grew stronger and stranger, grew until I could not always distinguish between what was real and what was vision. And I saw things that frightened me, saw darkness dressed as light, saw angels with faces that were wrong, saw God himself and his face was turned away. And I told Magdalene, and she said this was spiritual warfare, said the devil was trying to corrupt my gift, said I needed to fast more strictly, pray more intensely, mortify my flesh to strengthen my spirit. And I did everything she suggested, starved myself until I could barely stand, prayed until words lost meaning, whipped my back with the discipline until blood soaked through my shift. And the visions did not stop. They worsened, became a constant assault on my senses, and I began to lose time, would find myself in places with no memory of walking there, would wake with my hands bleeding from wounds I could not explain. And Magdalene watched it all with those enormous eyes, and she wrote everything down, and she said this was necessary. This was the path to transcendence, and I believed her because I had no framework for understanding what was happening to me. No way to know that what I was experiencing was not divine communion, but something she was doing to me, something deliberate. I do not know what she put in the tea she brewed for us each night, what herbs or powders or tinctures she mixed into the water. But I know now that the visions were not from God, but from whatever substance she was feeding me, that she had been poisoning me slowly, carefully, watching my reactions and recording them, using me as some kind of experiment or proof or tool for purposes I still do not fully understand. And when I finally understood this, when I found her journal hidden beneath her mattress, and read what she had written, descriptions of my symptoms, notes about dosages and effects, observations about how long I could be kept in this state before permanent damage occurred, I felt the world tilt, felt everything I had believed reveal itself as lie, and I confronted her, showed her the journal, demanded to know what she had done to me, She looked at me with an expression that held no remorse, no shame, only a cold assessment. And she said I should be grateful, said she had chosen me for something important, said the church needed proof of divine intervention, needed documented miracles to counter the growing skepticism, needed saints and visionaries to validate the faith, and she had been creating them, had been using girls like me to manufacture the evidence of God's presence, had been dosing us with substances that produced visions and recording the results as if they were genuine mystical experiences. And she said my suffering had served a greater purpose, said I should feel honored to have been part of her work. And I stared at her, and I understood that she was insane, that she believed she was doing
God's work by manufacturing miracles, that she had convinced herself that the ends justified the means, that my pain and confusion and terror were acceptable costs for the greater good of the church. And I told her I would report her, would tell the abbess everything, would expose what she had done. She smiled then, smiled with perfect serenity, and she said no one would believe me, said I was clearly disturbed, clearly corrupted by the visions the devil had sent to tempt me, said she had pages and pages of documentation showing my descent into demonic influence, and if I spoke against her, she would simply show them the evidence, would let my own experiences condemn me. And I understood the trap was perfect, understood that she had built my destruction into the very process of destroying me, that every vision I had reported, every strange behavior I had exhibited, every moment of confusion or terror could be used as proof not of her crimes, but of my corruption, and she had known this from the beginning, had designed it exactly this way. The abbess called me to the altar 3 days later, called me before the entire convent, and she said that Sister Magdalene had brought concerns to her attention, concerns about my spiritual state, about visions that seemed to come not from God but from darker sources, about behaviors that suggested demonic influence, and she asked me if this was true, if I had been experiencing such things. And I looked at Magdalene, standing beside the abbess with her eyes downcast and her hands folded in perfect humility. And I understood that anything I said would be twisted, that confession would condemn me and denial would be proof of the devil's hold on me. And I said nothing, simply stood silent while the abbess listed my sins, the visions, the wounds, the lost time. And she said this was evidence of possession or corruption, that I would need to be examined, purified, exorcised if necessary. And I felt the trap close completely, felt myself become the monster Magdalene had created. They took me to a cell beneath the chapel, a cell I had not known existed, stone and cold and absolutely dark, and they left me there while they decided what to do, and I could hear them praying above me, could hear their voices rising and falling in familiar rhythms, and I understood that I had been forgotten, that to them I was no longer Thomason but a problem to be solved, a corruption to be purged, and God, if he watched at all, watched from a distance too great to matter. And I was alone in darkness that felt complete and final. The exorcism began after what might have been 3 days or might have been a week. Began with priests brought from the bishop, men experienced in casting out demons, and they came with their books and their holy watcher and their absolute certainty that what resided in me was evil. And they prayed over me and commanded the demons to depart. And when nothing happened because there were no demons to depart, they assumed the possession was deep, was stubborn, required more aggressive intervention, and they brought instruments, brought pain disguised as purification. And I screamed that there was nothing in me, that I had been poisoned, that Magdalene had done this. But they did not believe me, said demons always lied, always tried to shift blame, always named the innocent to protect themselves. And Magdalene stood in the corner watching with her enormous eyes and her perfect piety. And I saw her smile, just slightly, and I understood that this was what she had wanted from the beginning, that my destruction had been the point, that I was not failed experiment but successful demonstration, proof that her methods could break someone so completely that even the truth sounded like lies. I stopped fighting after the first week, stopped screaming and denying and simply endured, and they took my silence as proof that the demon was weakening, that their methods were working, and they intensified their efforts. And I went somewhere else in my mind, went to a place where pain was distant and voices were meaningless. And I stayed there until they finally decided I was purified, finally declared that the demon had been cast out, and what remained was clean if broken. And they brought me back to the cell beneath the chapel, and they left me there not as punishment, but as protection, to ensure the demon could not return, to keep me separate from the others until they were certain I was safe. And I understood that I would die here, that they would forget me completely, that I would simply cease to exist, except as a cautionary tale about the dangers of spiritual pride. But I did not die, not physically. Something else died. The part of me that believed in God and justice and the inherent goodness of holy places. That part died and something else was born. Something that understood that survival required becoming dangerous, required using what they feared against them. And I began to pretend, began to speak in tongues during prayers, began to prophesy in ways that made them afraid, began to perform exactly the kind of demonic possession they had accused me of, and I watched their fear grow, watched them whisper that perhaps the exorcism had not worked, that perhaps I was too corrupted to be saved, and I pushed harder, became more theatrical, more frightening, and finally they decided that keeping me was too dangerous, that I needed to be taken somewhere else, somewhere with stronger protections, and they arranged to transfer me to a distant monastery, known for handling difficult cases. The transfer happened at night, happened with me shackled and hooded, loaded into a cart like cargo, and we traveled for hours through darkness, and when they stopped to rest, when the monks escorting me were occupied with their prayers and their food, I worked at the shackles that were old and poorly maintained, worked until my wrists bled and the metal finally gave, and I ran into forest that bordered the road, ran without knowing where I was going, ran simply to be away. And I heard them shouting behind me, but I did not stop. Ran until I could run no more, and collapsed in a stream, where cold water revived me enough to keep moving. I survived through stubbornness and spite, and the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. And I learned to live in the margins, learned that the girl who had been Thomasin was gone, and what remained was something else, something harder, and I learned too that Magdalene's poison had left its mark, had changed something fundamental in how my mind worked. And sometimes I still have visions, real ones now, unbidden and unwanted. And I see things that will happen, things that have happened, things that exist in the spaces between, and I do not know if this is damage or gift or simply consequence, but I use it to help when I can and to survive when I must. And I am alive when I should be dead, and perhaps that is victory enough. This is my confession, whispered to those who listen when the forgotten speak. And I tell it not as victim, but as survivor, not as someone broken, but as someone who broke the shape they tried to force me into and became something they could not contain. And I tell it too as warning that holy places are not safe, that those who perform piety most convincingly are often the most dangerous, that God, if he exists, watches from too far away to intervene in the small cruelties humans inflict on each other in his name, and that being forgotten by God is perhaps a mercy because it means he cannot see what we become in his absence, cannot judge us for surviving when survival requires becoming exactly what they accused us of being.